Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Lesaffre UK Ireland webinar, which today will be on the subject of living sourdoughs. But before we begin, a couple of housekeeping details, please. You'll find the best connection for this platform if you're using the Google Chrome browser. Secondly, please can you make sure that you don't have any other programs running that use the camera or microphone functions on your device, because that will cause some interruptions. And finally, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, so please address them to the moderators in the chat bar at the side of your screen, and we'll answer as many as we can at the close of the session. As ever, any that we don't have time for, we will answer by email. So to introduce our speakers for today, my name is Sarah Orton, and I'm a baker and technical manager at Lesaffre UK Ireland. And with us from the home of the Lesaffre Group in Lille in France, we have Benoit Demisel, who is part of the Baking Centre team with a special expertise in the development and application of living sourdoughs. Welcome to you, Benoit.
Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to participate to this webinar with you today.
Thank you. And I'd also like to thank Camille Dupuis from the Sensory Analysis Department and Panos Kaliotis from the Baking Centre team for putting together some short videos for us, which we shall see later. I also welcome Gulton Yagmur, a Business Development Manager of Lesaffre UK Ireland, who has to put together the nuts and bolts of this webinar, which we hope you'll find interesting and informative. So let us begin with a reminder of what sourdough is. The natural process of fermentation has been going on since microorganisms first colonised our planet, but the deliberate use of fermentation to enhance food and drink quality is actually relatively recent. It is known that the Sumerians first harnessed the fermentative powers of these tiny organisms and used them to brew an early form of beer. And archaeological evidence has shown us that the ancient Egyptians were probably the first to master the use of fermentation to improve their bread. This first bread fermentation was the method that we've broadly come to know as sourdough, the spontaneous and synergistic fermentation of a cereal flour by lactic acid bacteria and yeasts. The initial inoculation of a sourdough may contain around 10 different species of yeast and anything up to 70 different species of bacteria. During the subsequent refreshing or backslopping of the sourdough, different species needed to stabilise its colony. The numbers of species gradually reduces according to the conditions in which it's fermented and the type of cereal on which it's grown. The species that persist in the final sourdough are the product of a natural selection within the sourdough itself, with the dominant ones surviving as the weaker ones die away. The characteristics of the final sourdough in terms of leavening capacity, acidification, and flavour profile will largely be determined by these survivors. This slide gives an indication of the broad mechanics of the sourdough fermentation cycle. The fermentation of the flour and water mixture by the microbiota is achieved by a process of enzyme activity. These enzymes are naturally present in the flour and are also produced by the microbes themselves. The enzymes break down the cereal flours into smaller elements, which the culture then uses as food and nutrient sources for its own fermentative metabolism. The byproducts of the fermentation The acids, the flavor precursors, and other compounds also form part of the sourdough system. So that when the sourdough is added to the final dough, all of these elements are included alongside the microbial culture itself as part of the package, so to speak. The complex mixture of modified flours, sugar, amino acids, and enzymes together all form part of the fermentation system that is sourdough. And they all play their part in adding to the characteristic effect of each unique sourdough. The carbon dioxide, acid production, and enzyme activity all contribute to the leavening, aroma, flavor, and crust color of the final bread. The acids and enzyme activity both contribute to the development of the crumb texture. And these, along with the other specific compounds that are further byproducts of the fermentation process, add to the matrix, which gives the overall contribution to shelf life, including preservative effects. These effects can vary according to the specific species of yeast and bacteria that coexist within the sourdough. So that, for example, some combinations are more efficacious in prolonging shelf life, whilst others are particularly effective for gassing activity. It's important to carefully control the fermentation conditions and refreshing regimes of spontaneous sourdoughs so that the optimal levels of bacteria and yeast are maintained to ensure the consistency of the desired effects in the finished product. So you can see that the total effect of sourdough is much more than the sum of its parts. The synergistic fermentations of lactobacillus bacteria and yeast produce this complex material that has a multiplicity of effects in the finished bread. And this complexity is increased when you consider how large is the matrix of variables that can change the nature of the sourdough. Fermentation time, fermentation temperature, hydration level, intervals between refreshments, and cereal sources are just a few. Here you can see a linear depiction of bread-making processes using various types of sourdough. This first line shows that in the case of a spontaneous sourdough production and usage, the baker is responsible for maintaining his own sourdough in a viable, consistent, and especially uncontaminated condition in order to keep a constant supply available for his daily bread production. In the case of sourdough starters, Lesaffre is responsible for ensuring that every sachet of culture has the correct balance and consistent number of microorganisms to ensure that the baker can create sourdough that is consistent in terms of acidity, activity, and potential flavor profile, provided, of course, that the same fermentation method is used day after day to produce the sourdough from the starter. This third line represents the use of a living, ready-to-use sourdough. And here, Lesaffre takes responsibility for producing consistent sourdoughs also in terms of acidity and viability. Since the microbial culture in these ready-to-use sourdoughs is still living, the flavor profile of the finished product will depend on the bread-making recipes and processes used by the baker. And consistent bread-making processes will ensure a reliably consistent result. This last line is the least complex, and even though these are not the focus of our attention for today, this is just to remind you that devitalized sourdoughs are also in the Lesaffre Lavendo range. These are also ready to use and have been produced in a highly controlled manner to ensure that they are reliably repeatable in terms of flavor and characteristics, so you can ensure consistent results in your bread. Coming back to living sourdoughs, though, here is an illustration of the different effects of the yeast and bacterial fermentations and how they complement each other. You can see here that the yeast is giving us the majority of the carbon dioxide gas production, which leavens the dough, plus some of the alcoholic compounds that are the precursors to the bread flavor that we all prize so much. As far as the bacterial fermentation is concerned, we have two types of fermentation, depending on the type of bacteria in the sourdough. Homofermentative strains produce only lactic acids and a little carbon dioxide, whereas the heterofermentative strains produce both lactic and acetic acids. They both also provide aromatic compounds as byproducts of their fermentation, and these also contribute to flavour and aroma in the finished bread. In this grid, you can see how different fermentation profiles, flours, and sourdough ingredients can affect the characterization of the sourdough to a greater or lesser extent. For example, the type of microorganisms, the cereal sources, and the flour minerals all have a big effect on sourdough flavour, whereas the addition of salt greatly impacts the tolerance of the sourdough. And the speed of this fermentation activity can be increased by the use of sugar or malt. Now that's an awful lot of information for you to digest. So whilst you're taking all of that in, we're going to pause for a moment and ask you to take part in a little poll. And this asks the question, what is the biggest barrier to your using sourdough in your bakery business? You can access the poll to register your vote by clicking on the poll icon, which you should find underneath the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen. I'll give you all a moment to make your selection, but while you're doing that, don't forget that you can also add your own questions in the chat box for us to answer later. So I'll give you all a minute to vote, and we'll see which is the most common barrier. Don't forget to add your questions. Don't be shy. Okay. So far, consistency in fermentation seems to be the biggest problem. So I hope that what we're going to be showing you next will give you some ideas about how you can improve that in your own organisation. So now we shall move on to describe some production methods and applications for living sourdoughs. And first of all, let's have a look at some production processes. And we shall begin with the sponge type of sourdough. There are advantages and disadvantages to consider here. First of all, the kit investment is relatively low. Depending on the volume of sourdough you need to produce, there may be a need for a dedicated mixer. And beyond that, the investment is largely going to be in space for fermentation at a specified temperature. Covered stacking dough trays with wheeled bogies make for easy sourdough rotation, and a system for documenting fermentation times make for a relatively simple but streamlined sourdough production process. With a dedicated space for fermentation, more than one type of sourdough could be accommodated, and fermentation times can be managed with salt addition. There are also disadvantages to consider, and the main one being the management of sourdough fermentation if there's any kind of breakdown on the line which stops bread production for an extended period of time. Don't forget that sourdoughs are living systems, and lengthy extensions to fermentation times can change their characteristics. Hygiene is vital to prevent any kind of sourdough contamination, and a robust cleaning regime should be implemented to manage this aspect, and that should include very thorough cleaning of the fermentation dough trays. Now we're going to go over to Benoit, who's going to describe an application for a sponge-type sourdough made using a sourdough starter culture. Over to you, Benoit.
Thank you. Today, we will make a Panettone recipe with a sourdough starter as a fermenting agent. This recipe is made in 2 steps. First, we have a pre-fermentation made with LV1 starter. The aim is to activate the starter and begin the dough fermentation. For that reason, we are promoting the activity of the yeast part of the LV1 starter working at ambient temperature for a shorter time, in this case, 17 hours at 22 degrees Celsius. As you can see, we use strong flour in this recipe because of the high level of the sugar and the butter we are using. For the same reason, we add a part of the sugar and the butter to this pre-fermentation step to facilitate the incorporation when mixing the final dough, and also to acclimatize the microorganisms to these enriched conditions. In the second step, the final dough, we also add the sugar and the butter little by little to facilitate the formation of the gluten network. After 30 minutes of first fermentation, the dough is divided and shaped. The final fermentation is around 3 hours at 32 degrees Celsius. Now, we will take a look to a small video to visualize the different steps of the recipe. For sure, this recipe can be adjusted to an industrial process. For the first step of this recipe, we need to prepare the sponge with a leavened dough starter LV1. So, we take the starter, we put it directly in the flour. Then, we can put all the dry ingredients in the mixer to blend them. Finally, we can add the water and start the mixing. Mixing time is around 5 minutes in first speed, 3 minutes in soft speed, and 5 minutes in high speed. After 1 minute mixing, we can add the butter. After that, we have a fermentation time of 17 hours at 22 degrees Celsius to activate the yeast of our starter. Then, we can add this sponge in the final dough, using the rest of the flour, the rest of the butter, the rest of the sugar, softener, egg yolk, salt, and our maturated sponge made with leavened dough starter LV1. Finally, all the fruits. Again, we put the dry ingredients in the mixer. We blend them. And after that, we can add our sponge. As you can see, using the high protein flour helps us to handle this sponge. Then we add the liquids and we start the mixing. First speed, and after, during the second speed, we add the sugar step by step. Again, we put that little by little to help the gluten network to be well done. In this case, I put the sugar in 3 steps. As you can see, the gluten network is nice developed, and like a brioche recipe, we add the butter at this step little by little. After a new mixing time in second speed, we'll obtain a nice gluten network. Then we are able to add the fruits in the final phase. Just 1 minute in slow speed to avoid any weakness of our gluten network. At the end of this minute blending the fruits, we will have an elastic dough and a nice gluten network, as you can see in the video. After that, we let the dough rest around 30 minutes to 1 hour to recover and have a good conditioning of the yeast into our dough. Then you can see the dough is well proofed. We can start with the division phase. In this case, we use 450 grams per piece. As you can see, the dough is easy to handle. We also weigh 80 grams piece of dough to control the fermentation during the last phase of the fermentation of the dough. We don't give too much pressure in the proofing tube, so we just go to 100 milliliters. After that, at the same time, we can pre-shape the panettone. In this phase, we don't give so much strength to the dough. Then, after 10 or 15 minutes resting time, we can make the final shaping. In this phase, we give much more strength into the dough. So we can shape it and put them in the standard way into the mold, but we can also put upside down. It's another way to shape the panettone. After 3 hours at 32 degrees, we can see a well-proof dough into the proofing tube. So now we are able to put the panettone into the oven. So before of that, we put the egg wash on the top of the panettone, and as you will see, I will just cut the top of the three panettone I have made the standard way, and the others who are upside down, I will let them like that, and they will open alone into the oven. Baking time 40 minutes at 170 degrees. And after that, after the baking, we can see that the panettone have rise a lot into the mold, and we have the two ways of cutting the panettone. Here we can see the different phases.
Wow. Thank you, Benoit. That looks so delicious. I can practically smell it from here. I do have a couple of questions for you, though. I noticed that you're relying on the sourdough for the whole of the leavening process. There's no additional yeast in that recipe. Can you tell me how important it is to keep to the temperatures in the process you've described?
Yes, you're right. The temperature of the water, around 30 degrees, helps us to activate the microorganisms, both yeast and lactic acid bacteria. During the starter's fermentation, the temperature is lower, around 22 degrees Celsius, to promote the yeast instead of the lactic acid bacteria, because we need gas production for the volume but less acidity in the panettone.
Thank you. Also, can you give us any more specific details about the best quality of flour to use for this recipe?
Sure. As I said before, this recipe is really rich in terms of sugar and butter. Otherwise, this is also a long fermentation process regarding the first steps, around 17 hours, and the final fermentation around 3 hours at 32 degrees Celsius. This is why it is better to work with a high-protein wheat flour to strengthen the dough and avoid any dough weakness during the first step, and make the panettone rise during the final fermentation.
That's great. Thank you so much, Benoit. We'll come back to you for a further recipe and process in a little while. But now we should take a look at a simple installation of a living liquid sourdough system. This slide shows one of the formats in which we distribute creme de levain. And here we have a container on a wheeled base, which connects with the simple dosing system in the bakery. This tank contains 300 kilos of sourdough, but larger tanks are also available. You can see the advantages here. There is minimal investment, and in its simplest use, Only a refrigerated storeroom is needed. This tank could even be mounted onto a table and the sourdough dispensed into a jug. But for automated dosing into a mixer, some simple pipework may be installed, though a simple CIP system would also be needed to maintain appropriate standards of pipework hygiene. There's no manual handling of the sourdough in this system, and it can easily be extended if extra capacity is required, perhaps to dose into 2 mixing stations, for example. And although the same sourdough may be distributed to more than one baker, the living nature of crème de levain does allow for the development of signature flavors according to how it's used. And now we go back to Benoit, who will describe to us an application for this kind of sourdough in a short fermentation process. Thank you, Benoit.
In this recipe, we use the crème de levain, liquid living sourdough based on rye at a medium quantity, 8%. The recommended level of use is between 5 to 15%. In fact, the crème de levain is already matured and stabilized, so this sourdough is ready to use in the mixer to bring all these nice subtle flavors to our traditional baguette. As it's a short bulk fermentation process, we use a small quantity of compressed yeast, 0.8%, and the mixing time on second speed is short to limit the degree of the gluten development. This process allows us to achieve this creamy crumb and open texture thanks to a first fermentation around 90 minutes. This first bulk fermentation also means that we can reduce the final fermentation times of the baguette to between 30 to 45 minutes to have a good oven spring and keep a nice alvéolage of our product. Let's see the second video about this traditional baguette. In this traditional baguette recipe, we use the crème de levain. And for sure, we use standard flour, water, 8% crème de levain, salt, 0.8% of yeast, and improver. As in the previous video, we blend all the dry ingredients, 30 seconds in slow speed. And after that, we can add the crème de levain and the water. As we said before, the mixing time is not so long, so it's around 5 minutes in first speed and 3 minutes in the second speed. As you can see, the gluten network is not 100% developed. That's why we give 90 minutes of first fermentation to allow our dough. After this time, we can see the dough is relaxed and gassy. We can see better on this picture. Now we can start with the division of the dough. In this case, 350 grams per piece. And after that, during the pre-molding, we give quite a good strength to the dough, because during the final shaping, we will not give so much strength to the dough. As you can see here, during the last molding, I give just 3-fold, and that's it, because after that we have a short fermentation time to the baguette to keep the nice open texture of this traditional baguette. You see, I'm very gentle with the dough. As I said, small proofing time, 30 to 45 minutes at 26. And as you can see, when we go to the oven, the dough is not overproofed. You see the volume of the baguette is still small. Now we can cut. 5 cuts. After that, the steam is important to get this nice crust and shiny crust. Again, a little more of steam. And after 20 to 25 minutes in the oven, we get this nice baguette with this shiny and crispy crust.
Thank you so much, Benoit. Those looked absolutely awesome, those baguettes, and the crust looked absolutely wonderful. I must apologise to our viewers for the interruption of our sound system. We don't quite know what's going on there, but I hope you can hear us well above the music. Those looked absolutely good to see what they look like inside a bit later on. I noticed this recipe that you showed us uses the DCL Craft Bake traditional yeast, which has a slower activity rate to the one that a lot of bakers do tend to use here. Would they be able to use a high activity yeast for this process instead?
Yes, of course. Everything is adjustable regarding the equipment or the raw material we have in the bakery. If we talk about the yeast quality, different solutions can be used. First of all, we can decrease the dosage of that high activity yeast, but also play on the temperature of the hydration water or the fermentation room. Another solution can be to adjust the bulk fermentation time to avoid any overstrength of the dough.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. We'll have another little video a bit later on looking at a different process, so we look forward to that. But now let's have a look at a slightly larger liquid sourdough installation. But don't be alarmed by the size of the scale of the one described here. You can start with a much smaller one and add to it when necessary. So this is an example of a live liquid sourdough system and how it might be set up. And once again, there are advantages and disadvantages to consider. And the key one being the production of a bespoke sourdough that is unique to your own bakery. This type of system can be inoculated with a starter culture or with an existing live sourdough, and it allows the consistent perpetuation of the sourdough by automated control of fermentation times and temperatures, and the input of flour and water to feed the sourdough fermentation. So as you can see here, you might start with a single tank here for producing your sourdough, and then a single tank here, which is where you would hold the sourdough while you're beginning to use it, and then this tank you would clean out and you'd start your secondary fermentation. So 2 tanks is really the minimum. So the degree of investment really depends on the volume of the sourdough that you're looking to create for your process. So as I say, the minimum equipment would be a temperature controlled tank for the fermentation and a further refrigerated tank to hold the sourdough that's ready to use while the next batch is being prepared. But further tanks can easily be added to a system like this as the need arises, provided of course that you have space. It's more challenging to retrofit this type of system into a bakery since the dedicated floor space is required, along with suitable supplies of water, an efficient CIP system, which is vital for hygiene, and drainage. Space is often at a premium, and it could be difficult to extend the tank run when you need to. So that's something to think about, expansion of a system like this when you're considering using one in your bakery. Nevertheless, a living sourdough is a useful addition to a baker's toolbox. And now we shall hear from Benoit again about how it can be used in a long bark fermentation recipe to create baguettes with really rustic appeal. Over to you again, Benoit.
Thank you. In this recipe, we still work with crème de levain, but with a much longer process, which allows plenty of time for the sourdough to continue working in the dough and produce more complex flavor and aromas. To achieve this, we reduce the mixing time on fast speed compared to the short process. We also reduce the yeast, the improver, and the crème de levain quantities because of the extra bulk fermentation time. The bulk fermentation is around 18 to 24 hours between 8 to 12 degrees. The longer, the better. That is why we need to give about 1 hour resting time after the division to allow the dough to recover temperature to around 18 degrees before shaping. If not, the dough will be too weak due to a lack of gas production. The internal strength of the gluten network is improved by the pressure of the gas inside the cells.
That's great. Thank you, Benoit. And we should be seeing some examples of these baguettes a bit later on. Meanwhile, can you give us an idea of the difference in acidity development between these two different processes you've shown us, the long one and the short one?
The overnight in bulk fermentation allows the crème de levain to work into the dough and produce specific flavor compounds. It creates also a nice open texture and thicker and crispier crust. In this way, our baguettes have more rustic character, even in flavor, smell, and aspect. That is also why we reduce the quantity of crème de levain from 8 to 5% in this recipe, because we are allowing it time to express itself into the dough. We will also see later on the differences in flavor profile when Camille tells us about this aspect in a part of the presentation.
That's great. Thanks very much, Benoit. We look forward to that. So we've been talking about the acidity of sourdough, but I think it'd be useful to explain what we mean by this and how it's expressed in the dough. So here you can see from this slide, it's important to understand that there are two forms of acid created during a sourdough fermentation, the non-dissociated form and the dissociated form. And it's the ratio of these two forms within the dough or bread that gives the flavor characteristics. And the consideration of pH alone doesn't give the whole picture of the acidity in the bread. pH and TTA are measured in different ways using quite simple equipment, but they are complementary to each other. pH is measured using a meter, and the TTA, the total titratable acid, is a measurement of the amount of alkaline solution required to readjust the pH of the dough or bread to bring it back to neutral. And these levels both develop over time, as you can see from this graph here. Regular measurement of both pH and TTA of sourdough are extremely useful for monitoring its condition, and they can often be the first indications of something being amiss with the fermentation, particularly with spontaneous sourdoughs. If these measurements are monitored, it is possible to use them to pinpoint the optimal point at which to use your sourdough in order to maintain consistency of flavor and the texture in the finished bread. You might choose to use yours either younger or older, depending on the level of flavor that you're looking for example. So bearing all of that in mind, let's see what the flavor profiles are like for the products that we've seen being made today. And here I'd like to hand over to Camille Dupuis, who leads the Sensory Analytical Department in the Baking Centre in Lille.
Hello everyone, welcome to this tasting part of the webinar. My name is Camille Dupuis and I'm in charge of the sensory taste panel in France, and we are going to taste together these three products. First we will have the baguette with 8% of crème de levain. Then we will have the baguette in long process with 5% of crème de levain. And we will finish with the sweet product, which is a panettone based on only starter, which is a mix of yeast and bacteria. So let's go and taste. Let's start with our first product, which is the baguette with 8% crème de levain. If you look at the products, the crème is very cream, very aerated, and very light. When you open the product, it's you have a resistance and very nice aerated with nice cells crumb. Let's smell inside first. So the smell is very wheaty, very ripe wheat, and lightly sour. So let's try the crumb now. We have the flavor, which is very balanced between the sweet coming from the wheat and also a very light sourness, but the balance is very well respected in this product. Let's go with the crust now. The aroma of the crust is light malt and very round, but not aggressive, very, very sweet. Okay, I would say it's a good product, very easy to eat for anybody. So let's move to the second baguette, which is the one with 5% crème de levain in long process. So looking at the crumb, we have more resistance when you open the baguettes. Also, the crumb is a bit darker and we have more resistance. So let's try the crumb to confirm if the resistance is also a longer bite. So we have quite a long bite. Let's speak about the smell of the product now. Okay, so in this baguette, the smell is definitely sourdough one, also a little bit of rye inside, and the sourness is very mild, but still noticeable. The flavor is very close to the smell, so it means we have the sourdough flavor mainly, and then we have the rye in the end, or the cereal of the rye in the end, and the sourness is a bit more punchy than in the first product, and the persistence, the lingering of the product is much longer than the first baguette. So I would say this baguette is more for more expert taster. So the crumb is definitely signed by the crackers flavor, and very interesting because it makes the taste longer, much longer. Okay, so let's finish with the sweet product, with the panettone now. So we have a creamy golden pale yellow crumb. We have a nice and long structure of the crumb and a good resistance. When you smell the product, you get mainly the buttery and lactic flavor that we have to confirm by the taste, by tasting the product. Okay, so the buttery flavor is definitely dominant in this product. Also, it's kind of creamy, and the sourness that you have is not aggressive, but very lactic, very in the end. Also, you have the sweetness, which makes the taste and the overall flavor of the product longer. And again, very melty product in the mouth. Thank you for this very interesting tasting session. And any question you have, feel free to ask me.
Gosh, makes your mouth water, doesn't it? Watching that. So here we have a pictorial illustration of what Camille has just been saying, and I hope this will give you a bit more an idea of the differences in flavour profiles between the products. So the Panettone LV1, you see we've got a very strongly buttery flavour, but with a lactic back note that's coming from the sourdough culture. And also you'll notice at the bottom here is the alcoholic flavoring, and that's coming from the fermentation of the high level of sugar by the bacteria and yeast in the sourdough. This long crumb here and the fresh crumb here, that's the resistance that Camille was talking about. obviously the sweetness from the sugar, but it's also, even though the crumb is being described as being long in terms of the flavour and some slight resistance to biting, it's still very melt in the mouth. So there's a very nice tender eating quality there. Then we come on to the baguette with the short bulk fermentation. So we've got a very wheaty flavour, as Camille was mentioning, with some sweetness in there. Not a very aggressive sourness, so the sour notes are diminished. But there's also, interestingly, some dairy notes, considering there's no actual butter or anything like that in the recipe itself. All of those dairy flavours are coming from the lactic acid from the product. Nice thin crust also with these wheaty flavours. So that's what we might call an entry level sourdough for people who are not particularly used to eating this kind of sourdough. And then finally, the long fermentation sourdough, where we have allowed time for the bacteria in the sourdough to really develop their flavors with that overnight long fermentation, you may remember. So we have an increased expression of the sourdough flavor. The crackers flavor that comes from the rye and the mixture of the rye and the acidic nature of the sourdough itself. So that's expressed largely in the crust rather than in the crumb, but it's a very interesting flavour. And once again, we've got this quite big development of lactic acid within the dough, and that's because of the time that we've given it, that we've allowed it to ferment for. Slightly firmer and more resistant crumb than in the shorter bulk fermentation product, but overall we're giving a flavour that is more intense, more punchy in the mouth, but still not aggressively so, as Camille said. So it's all this is the kind of sourdough that for people who are a bit more used to what a sourdough flavour might be like, who are looking for something that's a bit more expressive in the mouth. Very interesting results there. So after all that deliciousness, let's just summarize what we've been saying today. So if you're contemplating the adoption of sourdough into your bakery products, one of the first things that you need to consider is the complexity of the sourdough process you're prepared to invest in. And this is maybe to do with equipment or staff or skills. But do remember that the devitalized products, even though they may have slightly less flexibility than the living sourdoughs, they're still a useful option if time or operator skills may be in short supply. But if living sourdough, are your preferred routes, then there are two options available from Lesaffre. Sourdough cultures, as we demonstrated in the Panettone recipe, offer great opportunities for creating signature sourdoughs, depending on how they're prepared and used. We have three in our range. The one that we showed you was the LV1, which is homolactic. The others in our range are heterolactic. So you have even more scope for developing signature flavors. And then there are the ready-to-use liquid sourdoughs, which are a good option for the simplicity of use, but they still offer some scope for product differentiation because their microbial colonies are still active, so you can still play some tunes on them. So we're coming to the end of our presentation now. It's been lovely to have your company, and we'll be answering your questions in a moment. But before we do, I'd like to thank Benoit once more for joining us today and giving us the benefit of your extensive sourdough experience. Benoit, if you'd like to put your camera on so we can see your lovely face. Thank you very much. It's been lovely to have you with us. Thank you so much for your work on this. And I must also extend my thanks to Camille Dupuis and Panos Kaliotis at the Baking Centre for their respective expertise in sensory analysis and camera work, and also to Galton here in the UK for the organisation of this presentation. So thank you all very much for your contributions. And thank you too for joining us and for watching. We do have a couple of questions which I'd like to put to Benoit. So first of all, Benoit, can you explain a bit about the differences between T55 and T65 and T80 flours? We hear a lot about these T numbers in the UK, but it might be helpful for some people to understand a little bit better about what the differences are between them and what effects these different flours might have on sourdough fermentation.
Okay. the number of the flour gives us an indication of the ash content of the flour we are using. The higher the number, the higher the quantity of ash we have in our flour, and also it gives us more nutrients to the microorganisms. So microorganisms are fermenting easier and faster, and it also gives us more taste and flavor to the bread. We can also say that a high ash content also weaken the gluten network. So we have to take care about that when we are using this kind of flour.
So there is a balance to be had between the flavor development and the effect on our finished bread. So, for example, if we were using T80, which I know gives a very good, very pungent, really lovely sourdough flavor in a product, we might need to, for example, add some knockback into our fermentation or something like that to strengthen the dough. Is that the sort of thing that we would do to?
For example, or we can also play with the recipe, playing on the water hydration, or if we are working with two steps process, with first step the sourdough, we can use this T80 in the sourdough to activate the bacteria and the yeast. And after, use T55 for the final mixing, and to get some strength into the dough.
That's a great idea. Yes, that's a very good solution. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. So you actually use the T55 to give the strength in the dough for the actual dough making process, but you rely on the T80 for the flavor in the sourdough. That's really excellent. Thank you. One further thing that's been asked is about salt. Using salt in sourdough fermentation, is it a good idea or is it not a good idea?
For me, it's a good idea because for sure on pasty sourdough, we talked before during the presentation about proteolysis and things like that. When you are decreasing your pH, you activate enzymes like protease. So to avoid this, to avoid or to break, if I can say that, this enzyme activity, we put salt, and as we know, the salt helps to break this kind of effect. I also put some salt into my liquid sourdough. Why? Normally, we don't have gluten network, as we can say, into a liquid sourdough. But to avoid any mistake in the recipe, if I, for example, I use my liquid sourdough in 4 or 5 different recipes, if I have already salt in my liquid sourdough, I don't have to think too much to adjust my final recipe of my bread. If I put salt, it will break my fermentation, so I can play on the temperature of fermentation of my sourdough and also on the time. So it's a little more time, or to increase a little the temperature of my proofer, and that's it. We have to know also that the big quantity of salt into a sourdough can stop it completely. To stabilize sourdough, it's one way to make it is to put 5 to 10% or even more percent of salt into the sourdough to stabilize it.
Stabilize it. Oh, very interesting. That's great. One last question before we close, and that's about rye bread making with sourdough. I know that rye does the rye dough. Rye bread making processes tend to use sourdoughs. Do they need to be specifically different in terms of acidity or to make a successful rye loaf?
That's true. What you are saying, Sarah, effectively to work with rye flour, we know that rye flour have gluten, but not at the good rheologic effect of the gluten we have into the wheat flour. So acidity helps to strengthen the dough when you are making 100% rye bread. We can also say that in the eastern part of Europe, acidity is one of the key factors for the success of bread. Yeah. So that's why we have this association between rye bread and sourdough, because of the acidity we can get with the rye flour. And as I can say also, rye flour have a high buffering effect, so it allows us to have longer fermentation and to get more acidity in our sourdough. As the pH is not decreasing so much, we can go further in the fermentation and get more tetrable acidity, what you explained before with the TTA. So this is also a way to have a stronger sourdough to use rye flour.
Rye flour, very interesting. That's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed for your advice on that, Benoit. We need to close the session now for today. Thank you very much, Benoit, again. But you can revisit this presentation on our YouTube channel. Simply type Lesaffre UK into the search bar and you'll find this webinar along with all those others that we broadcast during last year. So don't hesitate to have a look again if you like to revisit what we've been talking about today. If you've got any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch by email. And there's also further information on sourdoughs available through our website, which is lesaffre.uk. So thank you everyone very much for your participation today. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.